Movie tie-ins have a long history of being letdowns. Dating back to E.T. on the Atari, it's become general knowledge that movies based on films are usually extremely poor quality. A few titles have broken that mold, including the recently released Wolverine Origins, but the rule generally stands. With the Hollywood release of the most recent Terminator movie, so came the announcement of Terminator Salvation, the video game, hoping to prove for the second time this year that movie tie-ins don't need to be failures. Is it worth joining the resistance, or should gamers resist picking it up altogether? The year is 2016, 12 years after Judgment Day, where forces led by the computer system known as Skynet began a war against mankind that wiped out most of the population. Players assume the role of John Connor, one of the leaders of the Resistance, in events that serve as a prequel to the film bearing the same name. After receiving a distress call by a team led by David Weston, Connor goes off mission and begins a several-day journey into the Skynet compound where Weston's squad is holding out. The game's 9 missions can be completed in just under 4 hours, short by any standards. Those few hours are spent fighting extremely repetitive battles against only a small handful of enemies, broken up by the occasional on-rail segment. Beyond that, it's the same thing over and over again, with occasional cutscenes interrupting gameplay with little drips of story. As a prequel, Terminator Salvation doesn't fall victim to the sloppy storytelling usually associated with movie tie-ins. Instead, it finds itself struggling to find relevance. With the exception of Connor recruiting Barnes midway through the game, nothing really happens, and there are many missed opportunities to further bridge the 12-year gap between films. Salvation is a very typical third-person shooter, obviously inspired by Gears of War. The game features a cover system similar to the one found in Wanted: Weapons of Fate, with a few minor additions. When behind cover, pressing forward brings up an indicator showing the different directions Connor can move, and by tapping a button, the character seamlessly vaults to that location, speeding up gameplay. Although this is a good idea in theory, it doesn't always work, and there are many times where cover can't be taken behind objects, seemingly without reason. During the game, John Connor only meets a few different enemies, most of which require the same tactics to defeat. Apparently Skynet hasn't yet grasped the concept of creating armor to cover their soldiers' rears, and most of them can be taken down fairly easily with a few well-aimed shots to the back. This means each fight plays out the same way, as Connor tries to work his way behind an enemy to shoot them in the back until they explode. Luckily, teammate AI is usually fairly adequate, and distracting the enemy so the other squad members can take down the opponent is a valid strategy.
Thanks, me too.
Even so, this mechanic becomes overplayed pretty quickly, making the game's short campaign drag on. A second player can control Blair Williams, who accompanies Connor throughout the game, but only in local play. Online multiplayer was apparently planned but cut, meaning the only way to play with a friend is by sitting next to them and using split screen. It's better than playing alone, but not by much, and it doesn't help the game's issues. While Common and Moonblood Good both signed on to have their likenesses and voices in the game, Christian Bale declined. As a result, the John Connor in the game looks more like Mass Effect's Commander Shepard than he does Christian Bale. Nevertheless, Terminator Salvation is a fine-looking game, with fairly good scripting and voice acting despite a weak plot. The environments aren't terribly varied, but work with the gameplay mechanics fairly well. It feels as though destructible environments could have been taken advantage of, like possibly being able to collapse dilapidated buildings under the powerful T-800s. But the only destruction is purely cosmetic. Even so, there's really nothing to complain about when it comes to the visuals and sound, especially considering the extra effort of getting Rose McGowan, who wasn't in the film, to do voice work in the game.
Excuse me?
Beside the short length, there's really nothing wrong with Terminator Salvation. Sadly, that isn't enough, and the repetitive missions and lack of any replayability can make the few short hours spent in 2016 barely tolerable. While it's far from the worst movie tie-in this generation, it does little to change that stigma, and is best left on store shelves. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out the full text review on Gamervision.com.